Welcome to the Day of the Rake. If you can just take a symbol, just sort of a drawn symbol, and transform it into something that shapes people's entire lives. They structure their whole lives around whatever that symbol says. We're going to be talking about currency, and we're going to talk a little bit about the history of currency itself. So where did currency start from? Currency is a medium of exchange. In simpler times, early human history, it would have just been people would have traded whatever helped keep them alive. So mainly food. People would barter mostly over livestock. I'll trade you 30 goats and some cattle. It would be like livestock and the land that they could hold their livestock on. Sometimes things got a little bit more complicated. Sometimes you would have like people and labor. Maybe people would become slaves, or even if they're starving, sometimes people would sell themselves into slavery. You would have people make sort of relational promises, relational potential. Maybe they would, in an act of trade, give over their son or daughter into marriage, and that was what they're bartering, because they're bartering the grandchildren, they're bartering the union of the families. So somewhere along the way you have metals. And if you think of iron, it'll survive longer than cattle, than livestock, and it can be reforged or forged and reforged into all sorts of different tools. It could be a plow that you could use to till the land, make more food, or it could be a sword that you could use to defend the land or go steal your neighbor's food. That's the use of metals, at least in like early history. Now there are different types of metals that kind of carry different qualities. And like, why is it that we ended up with gold being the kind of definition of value when it comes to metals? Well, like I say, iron was useful for tools. I think it's silver. Like, silver is a really great conductor. You would think that silver would be more valuable to us now than gold. Like, silver is more practically useful than gold is. But the benefit of gold is that it doesn't oxidize. It doesn't rust. So gold retains its value. Somewhere along the way, we decided that if cattle is going to die, if iron tools are going to rust, gold will not. Gold will remain the same. And since there's a limited quantity of it, we can use that as a sort of representation of value. Now, the problem with that is that it creates all sorts of logistical concerns. And gold isn't really good for anything other than ornament. Like, you can't shape it into swords. It bends. It's not a good tool in that sense, but it's good as a sort of symbol. Yeah, gold lasts. That's right. So Nate says, "Hey Siri, give me a list of people who try to do state banking." Yeah, we'll get into that. So the problem with gold, though, is that it creates all sorts of logistical concerns. It's not really useful for anything practical. It's heavy, and once you have a lot of gold, then you need to start to make castles, and then you need to start to make fortifications in order to defend the gold. There's only so much gold you want to carry around in your pockets if you're going to go trade things. If you've got gold, then you have to worry about being robbed. Somewhere along the way, different communities, different groups of people, they decided they would pool their gold together in the form of banks. They would take the representation of their value, because the gold represented more than just gold. That became their food, that became their livestock, it became their house. So they would put it in banks. They would agree to lend it to someone else for the purpose of safekeeping. Because if you have one person whose job it is, or one group of people whose job it is to look after the gold, maybe they can do a much better job at it than you, because you're busy earning a living. You don't have time to create safes and safeguard the gold your whole life. Now, the problem with that is, well, that requires a lot of trust. What happens if I give someone else my gold to look after, and I'm even willing to pay them to look after my gold? And what if they do a bad job? What if either someone steals the gold and they don't want to tell me because they want to keep getting paid for protecting the gold? Or what if they just have a need for it, and it's tempting, And it's just a contractual thing. It's like, I would probably agree with them if I were around, but they don't have time to ask me, so they're just gonna use my money to invest in this thing, and whatever. I'm sure it's fine. I'm sure it's not a big deal. But before long, the gold itself, I have less and less say in it. It's kind of getting further and further away from me. Since I'm no longer interacting with the gold myself, instead of carrying gold around in my pockets, we create these paper receipts for the gold from the banks. I give you 50 pounds of gold and you give me a piece of paper that says Nathan holds 50 pounds of gold in our safe. So paper now becomes the physical manifestation of the wealth, not the gold. And that's where you start to get money from. Initially, money was connected directly to gold. Every dollar represented physical, tangible gold, and gold theoretically represented other value too. Another problem that you see is, if you have a bunch of gold coins, people start to shave the edges off. They start to cut the edges off. So there's just a little bit less gold. The gold is supposed to weigh a certain amount. It's supposed to be a certain amount of gold. But as people start to trim the corners, it's just a little bit less. And if you trim just a little bit, no one really notices. No one can tell. And if you take a lot of those shavings, maybe you can melt them together and create a new coin. It's easy for the people who are looking after the gold to just kind of make more gold, because they're diluting the value of all the rest of it. And then maybe they start to lend it out. Maybe some of it goes missing. Maybe they're just full on dishonest and they give it to their friends. And the only way anyone would ever know is if everyone came to the bank at the same time and tried to pull their gold out. So since people don't really do that, it kind of just gets worse and worse and worse. And then somewhere along the way, you kind of give up the facade entirely. You decide that this is all that matters. We don't even care about the gold. It's just the paper. There's no connection between the paper and the metal and the gold itself. All of the gold is, say, stored in Fort Knox or the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is looking after the gold supply. Well, even though the Federal Reserve is called the Federal Reserve, it's not a government entity. It's a private institution. So this private institution was supposedly backing all the currency. And then somewhere along the way, they just decide, you know what, we're going to move away from it being backed by gold, because gold isn't actually that useful. And we can just print this whenever we want. It's more useful to us to just be able to print money. And as long as people still behave, and as long as people are still using that currency, that belief is really what matters. The value that they're imbuing it with, that is what matters more than the gold. That's what matters more than even necessarily like the iron, the cattle, anything. So at that point, you have what's considered to be fiat currency. So fiat currency is not backed by, it's paper. It's just paper. Even though this is pretty convenient to be able to carry around, that's a huge step up from gold. What if even that becomes too cumbersome for people? Even that's too annoying. And technology advances and we start to move towards credit cards. It all kind of becomes digital calculations on a computer. So we end up in this situation where the majority of money that is circulating, it doesn't really exist, or it doesn't really represent anything. So what is giving it its value? What does it represent? Where's that value coming from? What do you guys think? Hate Love Nothing says, is it possible to start and create a real bank, or would one like the other, or become one like the others in the process? Well, people have tried to do this, and things get really dark really quick. Turns out the people who are in charge of the monetary system don't just let other people go around and create their own systems. So our fiat currency, where it gets its value from, is primarily debt. It's debt. It's an IOU. The money that you are borrowing, when you go to the bank and they lend you money, that money doesn't exist. It's not real. I mean, sure, maybe the paper's real. Maybe the numbers on the computer screen are real numbers, but the money doesn't exist. At least not yet. Not until you work enough to give it its value. You are the one who is creating the money when you take out a loan and put in the work. And all the bank is, it's like this sort of system of due diligence that is good at calculating whether or not you'll be good on your word, whether or not you're likely to pay back your IOU. So Matt says, yes, our debt-run economy, modern serfdom. Well, it's kind of like, is it really serfdom though? Because we're consenting to it. So if we're consenting to it, I don't know whether or not it's serfdom. When I started to come to some of these realizations, it was heartbreaking for me. It was heartbreaking for me to realize that when I'm paying for things, when I'm trading money, that this doesn't exist. This just represents people's debt. It's like I'm exchanging shares in human slavery. That's how I started to think of it. It's like, this is an hour of Matt's time. And I just that feels cruel. I don't want anyone to be in debt. I don't want to be imbuing this with that kind of value, but we are consenting to it. And so my alternative was okay, well then do I just not use the monetary system anymore? Is that how this goes? Am I just now some kind of off the grid guy because I've realized these things? But you can't even do that. You can't even do that because land is owned by the state, and you can't just go into the wilderness and create a living for yourself, because then they can just kick you out anyway. It kind of isn't a sort of serfdom. Matt says, fractal reserve banking is a scam. It creates extra phantom dollars in the economy. Once you get into the actual mathematics of it, as soon as it was no longer tangible physical things and it just became numbers, oh man. Matt says, our debt economy is partly why there's so much immigration, to get more low time preference people into the consumption machinery. I said on an earlier live stream that immigration isn't an act of altruism. It's an effort to connect the developing world with debt-based monetary system. So if you have someone who's independent, if you have someone who's self-sufficient, who lives in the jungle and hunts for their own stuff, that person's of no value or use to you. But if you can convince him that there's a better life for him if he just settles down, he doesn't have to hunt anymore, he doesn't have to go hungry, he can just sit behind a desk and consent to this system. It's easier to bring him out of the jungle to North America than it is to bring the North American infrastructure into the jungle. So cash is others' debt. Well, cash doesn't have to be others' debt, but it is now. The way that our system's set up, it is now. If we actually were able to pay off our currency, then it would contain actual value. But as it stands now, it doesn't. We can't even pay for the interest of our debt. We will never catch up. It's not possible to catch up. But really, it's what are we catching up to? We're catching up to IOUs. We're catching up to IOUs that a lot of people, in a lot of cases, were sort of tricked into writing because they didn't really understand the terms and conditions. When we're exchanging money, we're not thinking of it in those terms. We're just thinking of it in terms of, if I give someone this $20 bill, I can have a sandwich. Even if we were to make a sincere effort to pay off our debt, it wouldn't happen. It's not possible at this stage. It's too far gone. So that's why you start to see things like the Great Reset. That's why you start to see this sort of global socialism, because the alternative is everything breaks down. At least the monetary system breaks down. We have to establish, and we have to forgive all the old debts. We have to go through some sort of jubilee. In the nation of Israel, every 50 years, they used to ignore debts. They used to forgive debts. They would call that the year of Jubilee. We would have to go through that. But people who have a lot of money coming into them from debts, they don't want to give that up. So in order to hang on to this system, you end up transitioning into something else. Nate says, if you come up with $1 million in cash randomly, the government will actually suspect you did something illegal because it isn't documented. Yeah. People who win a lot of money in casinos, there are people who are really good at, they can work the casino game. They have certain monetary limits that they work within, because otherwise they trigger. It's even though they could win, they could game the casino system and basically win whatever they wanted, if they continued over and over enough, they'll only win a certain amount at a certain casino, and then they'll go fly to another place in the world and win a bunch of money there, because they deliberately don't want to raise suspicions. If you're just kind of coming up with money, then once you learn how to game the system does not like it. Okay, so let's keep going with this. You have livestock, which becomes iron, which becomes gold, which becomes paper, which becomes debt. Now, debt, you could think of that as labor. Maybe it's like a kind of intellectual debt, problem solving, or actual physical work. People pay off their debts all different ways. In order for people to pay off their debt, one of the most critical components is transportation. How we move people around, how we move goods and services around, how we get to our jobs, the common thread there, whether you're some sort of accountant or whether you drive some sort of big tractor, it's fuel, it's petroleum, it's the petrodollar. Think of the dollar not just being manpower, but it's a sort of replacement of manpower. That's where you start to see, people have been saying that the wars in the Middle East, they're all over oil. It's all about the petrodollar. And if the United States dollar, it's a good reference point that the rest of the world uses. Yes, the British pound has value. Maybe it's more commonly understood than the baht in Thailand. If I were to tell you 100 baht, you probably wouldn't know how much that's worth without looking it up. If I told you 100 pounds sterling in the UK, you would have a better sense. If I said $100 American dollars, that's universally, that's kind of the most widely understood. And the reason that it's the most widely understood is largely because the United States military is able to secure oil fields all over the world. They're able to secure the petrodollar. So because they have control over the petrodollar, they're able to back their own currency, which the rest of the world then takes its lead from. Well, that's an old system, right? We're starting to move away from manpower, even away from transportation. We're having this conversation digitally. This is all happening electronically. We're starting to see less gasoline-powered motors, more electric motors. My buddy has this cool little one-wheel skateboard thing that he just zips around on. It's got a good battery life to it. In a lot of instances, it's probably more useful than a bicycle. Electric motors, electric communications. We were saying even the money itself that we use, it's no longer even paper. It's just electronic numbers. And electronic numbers are a lot easier to fudge than paper, because paper, you actually have to print something. You have to have printers to print it. There's actually a material thing. But now that everything is getting electric, it's a whole different ballgame. And so that goes to where we are now. You see the introduction of cryptocurrency, Bitcoin being the most famous example of it. I believe that Bitcoin started as a casino currency. You would earn these fake dollars, it would be like the D-Live lemons. You would earn these fake dollars and then you would cash them out on your way out of the casino into real dollars. But it eventually became its own currency. And theoretically, the advantage to cryptocurrency is that you should be able to set up a system that's decentralized. So if you don't trust the banks anymore because you think that the banks are going to lose your gold, or they're going to clip the coins, or they're going to print more pieces of paper so the paper ends up being worth nothing anyway. If you don't trust them anymore, you can create an electronic version of that that's not controlled by them. Now, if we're to not be naive about human nature, there will always be some sort of backdoor. There will always be some kind of centralization. No one goes through all the trouble of setting up something like that and maintaining its value without them being the kind of person who is probably going to make sure they have a level of control over it. Because otherwise someone else is just going to take control of it anyway, and they're going to do exactly the same thing. So these things always have back doors, but a lot of times they're marketed as though they don't, as though they're safe, as though they're secure. And the other advantage to cryptocurrency, well, whether this is or isn't an advantage, I guess depends on where you're coming from. But this, no one can actually track really where this came from. You can, dust for fingerprints? Cryptocurrency will contain a record. It's blockchain, so it contains a record of where it came from. So you can both validate it and make sure that it's not fraudulent, but people can also track where money is going, which is good or bad for different reasons. Guess it depends on who is tracking it and what you're supposed to be buying, whatever. So our sort of like government system has a huge incentive to move towards cryptocurrency because like there goes the black market. In a way, there'll always be, I guess, black markets. So Powerlifter says, what do you think? Is that a good thing or a bad thing, switching to sort of electronic currency? Well, that's the thing, is that you can't really view currency as being a good or bad thing at all. It's just a tool. That's all it is. It's like a gun. It's a tool. You can use it for good or evil things. And you could say that maybe the people that are inventing guns, or maybe the guy who made your gun, he designed it and he created it because he wanted to do all sorts of bad things with it, and he's done bad things with the guns that he created. But when a gun is created and it's sold to you, that doesn't mean that it's tainted just because it's in your hands. You can take a thing that was tainted and you can use it for good purposes. And currency is the same way. Like, money is just a tool. Like I said earlier, that when I realized that this was just debt, this was just human slavery, I was so heartbroken. I was so upset. And I started to see money as evil. But that was kind of immature. Because, like I say, it is a tool. It doesn't have to be an evil thing. The problem is, like the Bible describes it as, the love of money is the root of all evil. The love of money, because it's like what it takes to make money as valuable as it is requires some shady dealings. I kind of glossed over this point earlier, but historically, when other people start to accrue gold and create their old gold-backed currencies, things don't go well for them. There's a lot of notable examples there. One of the more recent ones would be Gaddafi. Gaddafi in Libya. This kind of blew me away because like the West, we were intervening in the Middle East, and there's a lot of reasons for us to meddle in the Middle East. There's all sorts of horrifying things that happen there, just like there are all sorts of horrifying things that happen here. But we get involved in the Middle East. We get involved in the oil fields and everything. Now, we're under the belief that Gaddafi was like being really tyrannical towards his people. There's a video floating around on the internet of Gaddafi driving around in an open vehicle, and he's driving around hanging out the vehicle in a way that we haven't seen since JFK. And like, imagine Trump, imagine Barack Obama, imagine any American leader hanging out their vehicle that way. They don't have enough public support to do that. That's too dangerous. Gaddafi could do that. He would do that, and not only did he not get assassinated, but people would run up to the vehicle and be high-fiving him. It was like everywhere he went, there was a party. I'm not that well researched when it comes to Gaddafi. Maybe he did do some evil things. It seems like he also did some pretty good things. The money that the country was making from oil, that would get deposited into the citizens' accounts as well. Everyone sort of had a share in the oil fields. And they were becoming so wealthy because they had so much oil that they were starting to set up their old gold currency. And then America rolls in, he gets assassinated, and now you have literal open slave markets, human slave markets in Libya. That's happening now. And a lot of people say that however bad Gaddafi was, he was kind of keeping the other warlords in check. Again, I don't really know. What I do know is that if you start to set up a gold-backed currency and it starts to take off, that's you painting a target on yourself, right? Okay, let's kind of keep going here. So you have this electronic currency, you have crypto, you have Bitcoin, you have the reasons that it's incentivized. The less tangible currency becomes, and the more it gets represented by electronic numbers, it's like, how much is something like fame worth? You think of social media influencers. If they're able to reach a lot of people, them being well known is, in a way, it's its own value. Maybe they don't have a lot of money in the bank, but they have a lot of potential. They have a lot of earning power for people who want to reach a large audience. Maybe they can't translate their fame into wealth, but you can. You can if you can kind of hijack their platform or come to some sort of mutual agreement. So somewhere along the way, fame becomes the money, and it's very easy to measure fame digitally. Go to Twitter, look at your number of impressions, all the analytics. So what fame starts to represent is actual attention, how much attention from other people you're able to garner. And there's different ways of garnering attention, maybe through good ideas, or maybe just through cleavage, being attractive. That's probably going to garner a lot of attention. We did a stream a while back. We called it, it was like AI and demons. We talked about how we were programming demonic influences into artificial intelligence, into our social media algorithms. All of those sort of topics kind of become relevant there. But it's very easy to measure now how famous a person is or how much attention they're able to accrue. That in its own way becomes its own currency. So our social profiles become our currency. It's our social credit score. This has been rolled out in China. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but it's incredible how pervasive this thing can be. The potential there for curbing people's behavior. And we're starting to see it in the West as well. Now, these social credit scores, these social systems, they become so sophisticated that you can just nudge people in whatever direction you want. If you want to decide to convince them that toilet paper is really valuable, if you decide that you want to sell out the country's toilet paper supply, maybe you just need to get some people on TV to say the right things, and then all of a sudden people go into hysteria mode and there's no toilet paper on any of the shelves, right? Maybe it takes you a while to figure out that you actually have the power to do that, and maybe that's not your intention initially, but somewhere along the way you start to figure out that you're able to do that. And maybe not just with toilet paper, maybe with kind of anything you can get people to believe. Maybe you can incentivize or de-incentivize whatever kind of social content you want. Maybe if people are expected to have a livelihood at all, you can force them to have to be on board with certain ideas. You can compel their beliefs. You can compel their ideology. You can say, if you don't believe these things, you don't get to work here, because what you believe, it's not that it's a different belief, it's that it's hateful, it's evil. It doesn't matter whether that thing is actually hateful or evil, but if you can get enough people to believe that it is, well, the system operates that way, so it's no different. As long as you can kind of control the narrative, you can control how much value people ascribe to things, you can control how much attention is given to certain things. You're not just controlling the currency anymore. You're controlling the way that people think and their behavior relating to currency and value itself. I mean, food is innately valuable because you need food to stay alive. That's why food was like the first currency, things related to food. Once you have the food sort of sorted out, you can make it whatever you want. You can make it anything. We talked about how cryptocurrency uses blockchain and how you can actually track it. Now, the more information that you're able to accrue, if you can monitor where this money is going, you can figure out what people are buying. And if you know what people are buying, that gives you a real advantage in the marketplace. What if you could track every single dollar? You could figure out, you could have such tremendous insights about human behavior. You could figure out how people work, what people value on this huge global level. And what if you could increase your level of monitoring so that not only do you know what they're spending their money on, what they're willing to work for, even when it comes to things that are free, like what they look at, how long their eyes linger on a picture. Do they look at pictures of landscape? Are they looking at sunsets and sunrises and old ancient ruins? Hey, maybe they kind of like to travel. Let's advertise them some plane tickets. Let's start to create all, let's convince them to spend their money to justify the reason that they're working as hard as they are. Because their food's taken care of, right? For most people, food isn't a pressure. So the more information that you can gather, the more you can kind of manipulate that. Well, eventually you end up in a situation like what we're starting to see. We talked in a previous stream before about Microsoft's patent WO 2020 060606A1, which is the amalgamation of biometric reading and currency. So you think of how a smartwatch can like measure your heart rate or how many steps you've taken. Imagine a more sophisticated version that can measure your temperature. Maybe it can measure the types of brain waves that you have. That's not to say that it can read your thoughts, but it knows when you're in like deep sleep versus when you're hyperproductive or in the kind of delta brain waves. Or so you start to see this overlap between electronic currency and your biometric data until eventually they are they're so correlated. There's a connection between the two so much that your social credit score, that's not an account on the computer that you log into. You can't log in and log out of that. You don't open up your account. It is permanently fixed to you, to your heart rate, to your brain waves. Your internal systems are what is authenticating that currency. You have become shekel. And I believe that that's what is described as the mark of the beast. There's all sorts of conversation about vaccines, whether or not they'll be mandatory. I think there's all sorts of things to consider with the vaccines, like how much they've been rushed. That's a whole other discussion in and of itself. What's really on the table here, what's on the table is the presumption that the government gets to inject you with things. The presumption that you have to adhere to certain things in order to be able to participate in the economy. That's what this fight is over. Manitoba says currency will be things in the last of days. Well, that's really the question is, if currency isn't a thing, suddenly, what do you need? What do you need? You need food. You need to be able to protect your family. What do you need in order to be able to acquire food? Anyway, in concept, it's the same. I've been saying that the people who are going to consent to these mandatory vaccines they're following the same spirit that would cause them to accept the mark of the beast. And it's not to say that vaccines are the mark of the beast, that mandatory vaccines are the mark of the beast. I don't believe that. But I do believe that it's the same spirit driving people into these things. And I think the people who are going to accept mandatory vaccinations are going to accept the mark of the beast, unless they correct their thinking. But what I've been thinking of for a long time is that in the Bible, you would think, even for me to describe it as mandatory vaccinations, maybe that's incorrect, because I don't think we're going to be put in a position where they're going to point a gun at you and say, "Hey, you take this vaccine or you will die." That's not going to happen. I don't think. What's more likely to happen is your livelihood just gets so restricted, you lose your charter rights, you lose the ability to travel. You eventually lose the ability to have a job. You lose the ability to participate in the economy. And maybe you have to live off the charity of others or something. And that gives them plausible deniability. Then they don't get to convince them, they don't get to feel like they're the bad guys, but they are the ones who are doing what they've done to you. It always kind of confounded me that in the Bible, the mark of the beast, it's described as a choice. It tells you not to take it. And the very thought that it would be a choice was kind of baffling to me. Because it seems like this would be the kind of thing that would be forced onto people. But that's not really the way that their magic, so to speak, works. What they do is they have to convince you that it's your choice. They have to. All of their magic works that way. They'll tell you what they're doing to your face. That's what a lot of these movies are. That's what a lot of this programming is. I always pitch it, go watch my Lego movie analysis. That's a Luciferian tract. The same way that Christians hand out little pamphlets that tell you what the Christian belief system is. The Lego movie is doing that. with like the Antichrist worldview. That's what it is. They need to convince you to sign on to the terms of service when you use the program, so that it can never be said that you didn't agree to it. It's more powerful. It's more powerful if you were the one to agree to it. You know, like I said on my last stream, the ultimate salesman doesn't convince you of anything. He makes you think that it's your idea. It has to be this way for it to be effective. So it's a choice. So biometric cryptocurrency, the idea that we would merge with our social credit score, the ultimate currency there is obedience. That's what the currency becomes. It's social expectations. We are constantly programming these algorithms by our behavior through our social media accounts. We are literally setting the prices of everything in real time just by what we take a few extra seconds to look at. And what if everything gets so automated that no one is actually in charge of the whole system anymore? People have merged with machines all the way to the extent that our lives are we're just constantly waiting around at stoplights at 2 a.m., even though there are no other vehicles on the road. So Mark of the Beast isn't necessarily forced on you. It has more to do with psychology, magic, and will. It's an expression of will. Many secret societies use suffering to create value through hazing initiation rites. If you've gone through something difficult, you're gonna ascribe more value to that experience because you suffered to get through it. It's kind of what university is. Whether you actually learned anything at university or not, like even if you don't get into the kind of like Ivy League skull and bones, whatever, secret societies where they're doing their weird rituals or whatever, even if you don't get into any of that, the very process of university is mirroring that. It's a rite of passage. Whether or not you even learn anything in university, if you take out a student loan debt and then you sit there for years and years and years parroting a university professor's own beliefs back to them in papers, you are going to retroactively justify that experience. Even if you could have learned all of that another way, you're going to retroactively justify that experience, and you're going to uphold the system that put you through that. You're going to defend it because you're not. It's going to be so hard for you to admit that that was a waste of your time and effort, and you're going to look down on people who don't follow the same route or whatever. You're going to maintain that system. Some people go to university and genuinely learn very valuable things that they wouldn't have learned in other environments. That's what university is selling, whether or not they're actually good on that promise anymore or not. Neurocraft, university was so worth it that the deplorables should be happy to pay off all your student loan debts to the banks. Yeah, man. If universities were worth it, people wouldn't be begging for their loans to get paid off. At the end of the day, this represents a lot of people having to have died to secure this petrodollar. I'm not willing to do that. So I'm not, if I write some piece of paper, whatever, unless I'm willing to like kill to make this that valuable, this will just forever be something that I drew, unless you guys were to all decide that, hey, this is so valuable, someone gives me whatever. But this doesn't become a valuable symbol unless it represents sacrifice. So the people who do make those sacrifices, let them have it. Let them have that and let them suffer the consequences of it. If they're going to establish this system through blood, why would we compete with them? Why would we compete with them? Maybe that's the idea behind render to Caesar what is Caesar's. Caesar made this, he can have it. Why would I be competing for that? But render to God's what's God's. Well, what is God's? What belongs to God? What's the most valuable thing to God? Where does he place his value? It's you. It's you. He's placed it in you. It's you bearing his image. The act of Jesus Christ going onto the cross, you could say that was Jesus Christ. That was God emptying out his bank account in order to purchase you. If Jeff Bezos emptied out his bank account to give you something, that would be worth a lot more than mine. If God empties his bank account out for you, that's certainly worth a lot. And that is because of what he ascribes value to. So what are you guys ascribing value to? How do you create your worth? What are you giving your attention to? What is your opinion of worth even worth? What are your words worth? Goy says, I missed the beginning. Did you cover the modern money is digital alchemy and is actually a mind control spell? I didn't say it necessarily that directly. That's a really good point. Modern money is digital alchemy and is actually a mind control spell. If you don't understand that, keep thinking about it. Keep thinking about it. Goy Genius just summed up this whole idea. Okay, let's wrap it up. Let's call it a stream. We're high energy on the way out. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Let's shut it down. Hope you guys have a good rest of the day. Thank you for watching. Keep fighting a good fight. Stay in the schmood. Value what is worth value. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and render to God what belongs to him. And that is you. Nathan out. Crusader Cowboy, as soon as you posted that, my brain just went blank. It's like that symbol has so much power over me that it just to see it out of my peripheral vision took control of my consciousness. That's the power of these symbols. The best way to watch this stream is, if you want to be interacting with it, be in the chats, watch it on DLive as it's happening, then we can talk. I can engage with your ideas too. You can throw your 2 cents in there, or on YouTube while it's happening, you can do that as well. If you are going to watch these videos after they've happened, I don't recommend watching the replays on DLive. They're just, it's not as concise. I edit things down so it's more potent, and it's I get rid of kind of a lot of the unnecessary tangents, and I get rid of the awkward pauses, and it's more bang for your buck. So that's what YouTube is good for. I'm going to start to upload these edits onto BitChute as well very soon here. Hate Love Nothing says, so now electricity becomes power indirectly. Yes. Well, electricity becomes power directly even. Like, just think of the electronic motor. And Nikola Tesla, the guy who created alternating current in the electric motor through like magnets spinning. And every time you use a blender, every time you use a power drill, every time you use an electric motor, you have Tesla to thank for it. And he kind of went off the rails. He invented the things that he did as kind of visions. Apparently he didn't even need to conduct experiments. He would see these visions and he would move the pieces around in his mind, and he would conduct the experiments in his brain. He came up with high voltage versus low voltage. He said that in order for us to make further advances in technology, we need to be looking into philosophy. And people were like accusing him of doing all kinds of magic even. When he died, and he started to go pretty loopy. He started to like get obsessed with the number 3. If he lived in a hotel, and he would always have everything in multiples of 3, and he was terrified of perfect spheres, like a pearl. If anything was perfectly spherical, he was afraid of it. And apparently he fell in love with a pigeon at the end of his life. He was amazed that the pigeon existed from a sort of like kind of an engineering point of view. And he said that this one particular pigeon, he loved it the way that a husband loves a wife. Like he was in love with it. And anyway, basically everyone took advantage of him, and he died poor. Even though he gave us the modern world, he died poor. And the United States government like confiscated all of his research notes when he died. And fascinating story. But he started to see where things were going when he was inventing these things, because what he did was he kind of made manpower obsolete. He was the first one to basically multiply human manpower. And if you look at what he said about feminism, well, he didn't call it feminism. He said that he used to put women on this pedestal, and he thought he wasn't worthy of women. Because he was asked why he was a bachelor his whole life. He was single his whole life. And he said that he thought he wasn't worthy of women. And then as he got older, he felt that women were trying to usurp men and replace men. And they were abandoning the sort of cooperative spirit. And in a way, you could say that Nikola Tesla was indirectly responsible for that, because he was the one who invented the things that made manpower obsolete. All the advantages that men have through their strength, he provided the invention that created the greatest equalizer. HVYEQP says the guy who let a pigeon usurp his wife. That's a very good point. That's a really good point. Matt says, I'm become electricity, destroyer of tradwives. That's, yeah, kind of what happened.
The other day, this girl was like, hey, Sam, you're like a really nice guy, and I really like what you do, your videos and stuff. Do you want to hang out sometime? Why? So you can steal all my money? Bitch, MGTOW!